Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the College of Architecture and Design, Lawrence Technological University, and welcome to those joining us online. I appreciate you being here and tuning in. Before we start, do me a favor and make sure you have no laptops up and phones are away. A lot of that's just about presence. It's about being in the room. It's about paying attention and not mediating that through the technology or watching a YouTube video while being in the lecture so you can get your points, but not actually paying attention. There's also an important announcement for freshmen, which is the lectures included in this newly launched Experience and Engagement Passport program. So to get a stamp, you can grab the QR code or outside. And so again, I'm Philip Plowright. I'm a professor of architecture and the chair of the design department here at Lawrence Tech. The way that we run our programs, the way the College of Architecture and Design works, we focus on how design is evolving. We're very much interested in how new technologies and changing professional policies and practices reshape what designers can do and how they do it. And so we're a home, COAD's a home for multiple degree programs, graphic design, product design, with a concentration in mobility design, game design, interior design, architecture. We have a Master's of Architecture and a Master of Arts in Design and Technology. So across all of these areas, what we pay attention to is emerging tools, industrial workflows, and cultural forces that shape our built environment and the objects in which we engage. And so our curriculum is constantly evolving to stay relevant with these materials. And so the Design Times Technology lecture series is a critical component in this. It allows us to bring in current ideas and people who are at the cutting edge of the things that we're interested in and to invite them to speak to you. So we have an upcoming one on the final lecture is coming up on April the 16th, on Thursday. We have Caroline Johansson, who's a senior associate at Solid Objectives, Eisberg Lou, and she will be talking on design processes with early conceptual design thinking, material research, and construction. But today, and this is what matters, we have Dr. Lesley-Ann Noel, and she's going to speak on designing in the tension, relationality, complexity, and the worlds we design together. And after the talk, we'll have some time for questions. But I do want to introduce Lesley-Ann just a little bit, because she is probably the poster child for what the Design Times Technology series is actually about. So if we're talking about forces that are shaping the built world, few people understand this better than Lesley-Ann Noel. From Stanford D School to her current role as the Dean of OCAD University in Toronto, Lesley-Ann has pioneered ways to make design more inclusive and less mysterious. I think that's a good thing. Her work forces us to look at the invisible syntax of design, the relationship and the positionalities that dictate who gets to design and what worlds that we are allowed to exist. And so she is the author of Design Social Change, which we have the books down here, which are available free of charge if you'd like to pick one up. And she's a critical voice in how we negotiate complexity. And so today she will give us a talk on designing in the tension. Please welcome Dr. Lesley-Ann Noel.
Thank you. You can hear me okay? I mean, I'm mic'd, but I know Philip is also wearing a mic, so I'm just making sure that y'all can hear me. Okay, great. So I'm always very afraid to speak after Philip. All right. We've known each other for a little while. I mentioned that we have a growing collection of selfies. And every time I'm in the room with Philip, I'm like a little bit afraid because I sometimes say, my ideas are not as sophisticated as yours. I think of myself really as a practitioner, person who's in action. And theory and practice work together, you know. So like some people might say, oh, I'm a theoretician. The other one will say, I'm a practitioner. The reality is it all weaves together. I'm already off script. So I will try to be on script, and then I'll move away from the script, and then I'll try to get back on so that we could get through this talk in whatever time we have. Somebody will flag and say, okay, you have to let these students go. But yeah, I'll start off on script and say, well, good afternoon, everyone. That's literally on script. And it is really a joy to be here at LTU. I've heard about LTU through Philip and then one of my colleagues at OCAD. But I'm happy to be here, and I suggested this title, Designing in Times of Complexity and Uncertainty, because it's a thread that I've been working on for like maybe about the last year. And then I saw that this was a technology series, and I was like, I don't know if I'm in technology. But I am, because we are. That's part of the work that we do. So I want to start off acknowledging the lands that hold us and the histories that shape our presence here. So I'm from a lot of different places, and so sometimes I start off with like a lot of different land acknowledgements. I arrived here from Toronto, where I live on the ancestral territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat. And I'm a visitor to Toronto from Kairi, or Trinidad and Tobago, which is way down at the top of South America. And Trinidad is the land of the Kalinago and the Taino. And in this work that I'm doing, trying to live relationally, I am deepening my relationship with all of these different places and communities that I spend time. And right now, we are on the traditional and ancestral and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, the Three Fires Confederacy of the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. And these acknowledgements are not ceremonial. They are commitments to relationality, to care, and to justice. So I'll maybe show you a picture of my employer so that I can get attendance for today. So I am the Dean of Design at OCAD University, and I moved to Toronto in 2024. And I'll say Toronto is a really, it's an unbelievably exciting and a little bit overwhelming city, but it's just a 4 or 5 hour drive away, so come and visit us sometime, okay? So the theme of my talk today is designing in the tension, relationality, complexity, and the futures that we design together. And why tension? Because tension is where we live right now. It's where design lives. It's a space between competing values, between certainty and uncertainty, between what is and what could be. And tension is not something to avoid. It's something to work within. We live in a world of complexity, climate collapse, deepening inequality, loss of trust in institutions. We're all living and designing in complexity. Systems within systems, people connecting with people, and all of us woven into the wide environments that hold us. So maybe it's time to pause and ask, what if design isn't only about fixing problems or making things? What if design is really about how we relate to one another, to our work, to our planet, and to the systems that sustain life itself? The crises we are experiencing aren't separate crises. They're interconnected systems of a story we've been telling for too long, a story of separation, control, and endless growth. So in the world of design, we are encouraged to design more, make more, do, be faster, work very individualistically. I don't know if that's a word. But actually, there's a growing group of designers and design theorists who are actually starting to ask other questions and push, promote different ways of working, like working relationally, slowing down, and maybe to challenge this story about growth. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. So my name is Lesley-Ann Noel, and as I mentioned earlier, I have the honor of serving as the Dean of Design at OCAD University. And I often share a bit of my positionality when I speak. So I am, as I mentioned earlier, from Trinidad and Tobago. and I've lived in different places across the Americas and Africa. I'm the mother of Azure, who is that second image there. He's no longer that size. And I live with the memories of many places that I call home, but I don't actually live in a place that I consider home. And that's also part of the tension that I have within me. You know, I've been outside of home for the last 10 years, and I've moved many different times, and I'm always a little bit displaced. And so maybe that is part of my identity in the work that I do. So all of these elements of my identity affect how I show up in the world, my displacement, my motherhood, my Caribbeanness, my Latin Americanness, all of that affects the way that I ask these questions. And I come to this conversation as someone who believes design is at its core relational, about empathy, care, and courage in the face of uncertainty. Like many of you, I see design not as a way to control complexity, but as a way to understand it, a way to create systems that nurture equity, resilience, and flourishing together. And I have incorporated these principles such as equity, resilience, envisioning thriving futures, and others into my research agenda. And these values have guided my work in education, public health, community engagement, and civic innovation. And now that I'm in higher education, in administration, as in the role that I'm in, I continue to apply these principles in my role. And that, I'll tell you, kind of without a filter, I'll tell you, that is actually a challenge, because I've been talking all along about equity and participatory design and all of these principles, but before I was speaking about them through a different lens, and now I'm the man. I'm an administrator, and I have to think, okay, how am I bringing these principles that I've said were important all along into the work that I'm doing? I'm trying. You can check out, message my faculty members to see what they think about this. We gather at a time when the world feels heavy: climate collapse, deepening inequality, a loss of trust in institutions, war. And these aren't separate crises. They're all symptoms of the same story we've been telling for far too long, a story of separation, control, and endless growth. As one philosopher once said, it's all a question of story. As Thomas Berry reminds us, we are between stories, letting go of one narrative and writing another, rooted in interdependence, care, and shared destiny. We're slowly letting go of a story that told us we could stand apart from nature, from one another, from responsibility, and we're beginning to write a new story, one rooted in interdependence, care, and shared destiny. And this new story invites design to become something more, a practice of mending and healing relationships between humans and nature, between culture and ecology, between innovation and justice. It invites us to see design not as what we make it, but as how we relate. And so to prepare for this brief talk and the work that I've been doing for the last year or so, I engaged in extensive reading and reflection on the theme. And I particularly focused on the work of thinkers like Arturo Escobar and some of my colleagues, Victor Udoa and Renata Marx Leitown, and Peter Jones, and the work of the Brazilian Nego Bispo, whom I've been reading recently. And I've also attempted to see my own work and its relevance to the themes of complexity and relationality, and I will share some of these ideas from this reflection in this talk. And then maybe you all will pull me off a script and, and we'll talk some more. You know, in the work that I do, I just do things, right? And that's part of the way that we think and do and show up as designers. You know, that's part of the beauty of design. We have an idea, we work on it, and we get a prototype, and then we can reflect. And so some of the work that I do is, you know, I'll look back on it maybe like 5 years later and say, actually, it was a little bit naive. But it is me just putting ideas out into the world and then getting some feedback on them and continuing to tweak them. So, you know, I'll just throw this out to everybody in the room. Remember, you have a point of view and some questions that are probably very important to you. Put them out there and get some feedback from them, right? So I have had to get over my own imposter syndrome, because if I'm doing things and putting these ideas out there, I don't always know what my own expertise might be. And so sometimes, you know, like even in situating my work among the work of these people, it takes a lot out of me to say, oh, could I be in the same panel there with Arturo Escobar and Victor Udoa and these people? But yes, we do have ideas and expertise that we will put out there. I'll get back on script, right? So across the world, decolonial and indigenous thinkers remind us that relationality isn't just a concept or a design principle. It's a way of being. It asks us to move beyond the old hierarchies and assumptions of modernity, beyond self-centeredness, individualism, control, and extractive ways of working, and to instead nurture healthy relationships, relationships that hold space for many voices, many truths, many ways of knowing, and also to return to mutual care, interdependence, and collective well-being. Relationality invites us to design from the heart outward. It asks us to see knowledge not as something that is owned, but as something that is shared, co-created through lived experience, storytelling, and wisdom. And when we design this way, we honor the many voices, truths, and ways of knowing that coexist. When we look to indigenous and Afro-descendant traditions, we remember that this isn't a new idea at all, and communities around the world have long lived this truth through circular, intergenerational practices that sustain life rather than commodifying it. And we begin to see that complexity is not a problem to be solved, it's the essence of life. And when we design with that in mind, we design for flourishing. So, you know, maybe one point that I could pick up here to share with you is, you know, I just said that you all have your own questions that drive the designs that you're doing. And actually, we need then this mix of these many different questions to make design better. So I always start design exercises asking people about positionality or talking about my positionality because I do want us to make relationships more complex so that better questions will emerge, right? So what does relational design look like in practice? In healthcare, for example, we're seeing communities reimagining care, not as a service to deliver to people, but as a relationship co-created with them. When communities are part of designing their own systems, solutions become more humane, more equitable, and more sustainable. We can apply that same relational mindset to technology, including artificial intelligence. What if we designed AI systems that supported community well-being instead of optimizing for profit? AI that listens instead of surveils, that collaborates instead of controls. That's the kind of design challenge relational thinking opens up. And in our cities, those dense, vibrant, living ecosystems of human and non-human life, relational design calls us to think regeneratively, to move beyond the logic of growth and control and instead design for care, connection, and balance. Imagine cities that are living systems where nature, culture, and technology do not compete, but collaborate in reciprocity. That's the promise of relational design, a movement from extraction to exchange, from domination to dialogue, from separation to interbeing. So, complicate, that's a word that I want you to go away with, right? It's complicated, and I want you to complicate, right? So part of living and working in this tension that we're in is to resist the urge to simplify. So simplification has been a mechanism of colonization. colonial systems need complex societies to be manageable. Simplification can remove the context, erase rich histories, create hierarchies and binaries. Complicating resists the colonial habits of reduction, erasure, and premature certainty, and restoring forms of knowing and being that colonial systems worked hard to flatten. So decoloniality and operating decolonially restores complexity, so complicate. And I know it's complicated because, like I said, now I'm an administrator and I have to live with that tension that I'm telling people to complicate, and then they bring this complication to me, and then what, right? How do we resolve the mess? But actually, we need the mess to think through some of the issues, right? As you complicate, reintroduce story, context, multiple truths, and situated meanings, and slow down. Complicate, question everything, evaluate the tensions, analyze power and hierarchy, and imagine other ways of doing things. So I'm going to share in the next few slides some of my complications, or some of my messiness, right? Where in my own work, I've pushed against simplification and flatness, and I've encouraged complexity, complicators, and complications, as I've urged people to complicate their identities and their points of view by, for example, reflecting on their positionality through tools like the positionality wheel, which encourages conversations about similarities and differences. And you know, the funny thing or interesting thing is a lot of my, these things that I'm going to share, these are messy prototypes that I put out there and then afterwards got a little bit more of a scholarly analysis from other people. So the positionality wheel is one. I literally needed to create a tool to get people to talk about their positionality for a workshop on a Saturday. And I created this wheel on a Friday night in 2018. And I have not significantly adjusted it since then. Now, of course, afterwards, I learned about other people's positionality wheels. I've gotten more scholarly language, I suppose, around the wheel. But what I really was trying to do was to create a tool that would allow people to talk about the complexity of identity. So I'm sharing this with you so that you know that it might not be this tool, but you can create things and tools and mechanisms to get people to have the conversations that you think are important and put them out there because other people may want to use your work. So I've put the positionality wheel out into the universe and it's been downloaded. The last time I checked, it was downloaded more than 800 times, right? Because people are trying to have conversations like the conversations maybe you're having. Another messy prototype, the designer's critical alphabet, which is a deck of cards designed to help designers to develop their critical awareness of the world. I created this when I was living in California for a year, and I was really very concerned. This is a conversation about technology. In living in California, I felt that I was in these conversations about technology that were not critical. And so like maybe we were talking in a tech firm about designing an app for X, let's say. Let's design a home sharing app where I can rent out my extra bedroom. You all know which app I'm talking about, right? This is one of the real conversations where we were talking about that app and I just felt, why are we not talking about marginalization or race? Or there were just some more difficult questions that I wanted to introduce in some of these conversations, and that's how this critical alphabet came up, where we'd be having conversations, and if I felt there was something missing, I don't remember, neocolonialism, like I remember when I wrote it down, and I don't remember what was the exact point, but I felt that we needed to talk about the way colonialism was coming back into our society. So I wrote it down, and then I went and got the definition, and I made that card. And each card in the deck really evolved like that, where as we were having these conversations that were not critical, I was trying to see, well, what theory could we introduce to get people to talk about things? Or what kind of question would get people to remember some of these questions to remember to have more critical discussions and conversations? Because if the technology that's driving the whole world is being created through a non-critical lens, we're in trouble, right? And some of us have to complicate and introduce these questions. So that's what that prototype was about. And again, I just put it out in the world. A friend of mine at another university wanted to buy it, and I put it on Etsy, and it's not available anymore on Etsy. It's not available anymore because now I live in Canada and it's just too complicated. But the last time I checked, more than 2,000 of this messy prototype then had been acquired by people who were also looking to complicate their conversation. So again, I share this to say that when you have an idea, other people may also be interested in that. The Black Experience in Design is a book where I'm one of the editors, and there were 6 editors in all. We were upset about, again, the lack of criticality, as people asked post George Floyd's murder, where are the Black designers? People asked over and over and over. And as a Black designer, I would get that question. And so myself and the other editors, we actually sat down and we said, well, actually, there are Black designers, and if you don't know where they are, then maybe you're not asking enough people. But we put together this anthology with 70 Black designers contributing to the work. And then we encourage multiple modes of participation to facilitate storytelling by these designers, many of whom might not have thought of themselves as writers. So we created many, many ways of people being involved in the book. It was supposed to be like a 250-page book. It ended up being a 500-page book because the editor said it was all just too good. There was nothing that they could leave on the floor, and it's still going strong. But again, it was another kind of messy prototype where we started thinking, well, maybe it's a magazine something, maybe it's a journal article, maybe it's a special review, but you just do things, and in doing things, you change histories. And another messy project or prototype, I'm a member of the Design Research Society, which is how I know this gentleman here. And I would go to their conferences and I would just think, nobody's talking about stuff that I want to talk about, right? And what are the things that I want to talk about? The reality is I'm a dark-skinned designer from the Caribbean, from the Global South. There are some other things that I might be interested in, whether it's around people and methods or materials and so I started to talk with a few other people in the DRS who were saying similar things like, where do we bring these issues? And my friend is Renata Marques Leitão, who is Brazilian. We saw this gap and we said, okay, we're gonna create a group where we will complicate design histories, presents, and futures, and really focus on the design work of from many worlds outside of Europe and North America. So we created the Pluriversal Design Special Interest Group, and the pluriverse, the idea of the pluriverse is a world of many worlds. And so our group is about shining the light on many, many worlds of design. The worlds that we focus on change. So like last week, we did a talk where we were focusing on women in the Middle East, women graphic designers in Egypt, but generally across the Middle East. Our next talk will probably feature somebody from Colombia, but we are looking for design practices around the world to kind of change up and open up the frame of how people talk about design. And then another project is, well, this is a messy illustration, but the illustration is part of a series of illustrations. It's 5 images where the curriculum is depicted in an image, and this image is representing a Pan-African design syllabus. But it's part of a thought experiment about design curricula starting in different places. So if we're letting go of materials and technology and some of the other things that we might say are important to design, what does that design curriculum look like? And so this is one where I'm thinking of, through a Pan-African lens. I did another one through maybe a Latin American epistemological lens. And then I've been experimenting with what are the questions that we really think are important in design. And these questions change according to place. And so this complexity has in fact been embraced by thousands of people who have engaged with the tools and the frameworks that I've created over these last 10 years or so. But it's not easy work, right? So I just want to share with you this Frantz Fanon quote: "Decolonization, which sets out to change the order of the world, is a program of complete disorder, which is frightening. But decolonization seeks to dismantle the existing colonial world order, which is built on oppressive systems." And so this path between dismantling and remaking, as you change the things that you think are important in the world, will seem chaotic. And in our design work, it is in fact our duty to see and call out oppressive systems, to create tools and frameworks to overturn these systems, knowing that this path might look chaotic. So I'm going to encourage you, something else to take away from today. Get comfortable with this complication and this chaos and this disorder, knowing that it is part of the work, and it actually will give you confidence to make choices that go against the status quo, whether these are design choices or ethical choices or other choices, right? So today, I didn't start off with a reference that's related to this slide. So I studied design 100 years ago. I studied in Brazil in the 90s. And part of the work that I'm doing is maybe a response to my design education that I actually found was non-critical, right? Now, I lived in a very political, critical context, and the government changed several times, the currency changed, so there was a lot of political activity, and that political activity never made it to the classroom. And I think, my 20, 30 years of this kind of exploration is probably as a result of not exploring these questions in the classroom in undergrad, when the world was on fire around us, but we were coming back and we were designing pretty things, right? But today, I think that the design world has changed. So the world that I studied in was flatter, it was less political, less complicated in the early 90s. And we focused primarily on beauty, and the world of design has changed so much. And there are many design books about activism, society, and diverse perspectives today. And so we could say that we're living in a postmodernist design era that is not afraid to talk about politics, and where people engage with systems, complexity, relationality, and more throughout the design process, because these aspects, complexity, relationships, and non-flatness, lead to a deeper understanding of key issues. So my book, Design Social Change, fits within I guess, this world of people in design who are talking about change. And I recently heard a design researcher, Katja Schimmel, describe this movement as in design, which is about creating change, political, social, environmental, and values-driven design, as design thinking 3.0. So I don't know, we might be in a new paradigm. Philip, we'll have some conversation about that. But in the last few moments of this talk, I'll share some of the big ideas of the book, Design Social Change, and you could see how you could apply them to your work. Or you could see how you could be inspired to go off and write your own books about design. So, you know, so I was invited by the folks at the Stanford D School to write a proposal for this series. Design Social Change is part of a series, and I actually thought, okay, here I am trying to move through the world through this decolonial lens. I'm gonna shake things up a little bit, right? So I didn't do a traditional proposal that who knows whether they were expecting it or not. It was actually a very fun project to work on. But I wanted my book to not actually look like a design book from San Francisco, right? And I wanted it to be a Caribbean, maximalist, Freirean manifesto. And who knows, maybe I got there. When you get a copy of the book, you'll be able to see. But we live in an abundant world where there is space for many, and I wanted that thriving and abundance to be part of the story. As you read the book, you'll actually realize it was written as a cookbook. So that was the proposal. It was a cookbook about 10, with about 10 recipes for changing the world. And the original title was Cooking Up Change. And this literally is one of the images that was in the proposal. As I said, I was trying to have fun. And I said, well, okay, what if we could think about the ingredients that we need to make some change? There are 3 big ideas in the book, right? There are, in fact, I think 10 or 11 recipes, but they're in these different sections. And so the first thing is about building a critical awareness of the world, or conscientisation. So actually, I'm using somebody else's theory, right? So this is Paulo Freire's theory. Conscientisation is you seeing the world and understanding the world around you. So when I ask people about their identities, whether they share it or they just reflect on it, that's actually the first step of conscientisation, where you have to first be able to see yourself, you have to see the world around you, you have to start to ask a lot of questions of the world, because we can't change the world if we can't see it. So we have to learn to see it and ask these hard questions. The second big idea in the book is about deepening emotional intelligence. And in this section, I'm asking people to get comfortable with difficult emotions, right? Lean into anger and joy as we do this work about change, even though they're merely 2 emotions in a wide range of possibility, right? Anger is one that I know that I was actually taught to be like a little bit afraid about anger, right? My mother has this very well modulated, quiet voice. My father doesn't get angry. We don't get very angry. We're very middle class, and we kind of look at other people like, oh my God, look at what those people are doing, right? But actually, anger is really important in this design work that we do, because we have to learn the cues of people that we're working with, people that we might be designing with, people that we might be designing for, you know, and anger then becomes a really important part of that story, as well as joy, right? And then another recipe in this section is about working with other people, because actually you don't change the world by yourself, right? Then the third big idea from Design Social Change is about envisioning equitable futures, where we're using these design abilities that we have, seeking to change existing situations into preferred ones, where we are focusing on futures and utopias to design worlds without the constraints of today. And this is what we do as designers. We imagine new possibilities, but in this book and in this work, I'm asking people to think about the worlds that we need. And we figure out how we facilitate these conversations for people. So like here, I have 2 images from some field work that I've done with children. It's design work. using a method called critical utopian action research, where these children start off critiquing the world around them and then drawing the utopias that they're interested in. So one child's utopia was about not having to go to church on a Sunday morning, but being able to participate in church remotely. This was 2017, so this is pre-pandemic, but he already thought about church, Skype church. And then the second child's future is much simpler. It's about a school that doesn't smell, right? Very, very simple. Nobody knew it was a problem, but at least they were able to articulate it. And so some of the work that we do as designers is about making sure that people can talk about or express what it is they want in the world. Or it might be that we want to just use post-it notes and ask people, where do they want to go? So this is from an exercise that I did with students every year, where I'd give them a target year in the future, and they have to finish the sentence and say, in 2050, there will be more of something or less of something. And then based on these, this brainstorming, then they would figure out where they wanted to focus some of their design attention on afterwards. So all of this complexity plays a role in moving us towards what many now call pluriversal futures, or futures where many worlds can fit. A world that values complexity, care, and diversity over control and conformity. This isn't abstract, it's deeply practical. It's about how we teach, how we collaborate, how we make decisions, and how we hold one another accountable. It's about cultivating relational practices in our work, our institutions, and our daily lives. It's about learning to be good ancestors, designing with humility, curiosity, and care for those who will inherit what we create. So I invite you at this moment to see every space that we're in as a relational space. I mentioned, earlier on the challenge that I have now as I work as an administrator. That line about relationality is actually the thing that I keep in the back of my head all the time, that it's all about relationships. The specific projects that we do will come and go, but will the relationships persist? And that makes me do a different kind of work, and maybe it makes other people do a different kind of work as well. So we have spaces to learn, to challenge each other, and to be inspired and transformed. And we have to embrace these spaces as we move through the world. Relationality isn't a destination, it's a practice. It asks us to be present, to listen deeply, and to act with intention. The systems we design are not just about the future, they're about the stories we tell, the relationships we nurture, and the worlds we choose to create. So I'm going to thank Philip for the invitation, and Andrea for all of the support, and thank COAD and LTU for this, and open it up to some conversations, and maybe we have some questions. Thank you.
Do we have questions from the audience? I've got about 14 myself.
You have 14?
Yeah, a couple.
Well, I just laughed.
Maybe I'll.
I see one over here.
Before I hog the next 2 hours, you guys are staying for 2 more hours, right?
Thank you so much for the talk. My question is, when trying to incorporate decolonization, it seems like it works in an academic setting, but in practice, how do you tell your students to try and work that into practice when they get out in the world?
Well, that's maybe the tension that I'm in now, that before technically I'm still an academic, but before I was more in an academic space where I could write about decoloniality. Part of the draw for me of going to OCAD is that OCAD calls itself a decolonial school, right? And so it's front and center in the mission everywhere. And so we talk about decoloniality in ways that I've never really been able to before, right? So how does it look in reality? It's messy. And sometimes we have to own the messiness, okay? And we have to know that, you see, if all of these systems that we're in, and they are part of systems. So if we move one thing, it kind of sets off this little thing, like a cascading effect of many other things that we have to change, right? I'll give you an example that's a little, I didn't think about this before, so I don't know what backlash I'll have for sharing this example, but I'm going to share it anyway. So we have, OCAD is famous for doing a very large black hire and indigenous hire, which a dean before me, Dory Tunstall, she championed those two hires. And on paper, it sounds amazing. And then the reality is actually there's other work that then, you don't just bring people in and sprinkle them across the school and now the school is decolonized, right? So it's like, we are always in that tension of we change this and now we have to change 10 other things as well. And as long as you can live with that tension, and the people that you work with also have to be able to live with that tension, then, you know, that's how you move through, right? So the example I was going to give is that an indigenous faculty member told me the other day, we were hired to decolonize, and when I teach through my decolonial worldview, now we have like 100 student complaints, whatnot. And really what happened is that we changed one thing and then we had to change a few other things as well. And so it means that we're constantly having to tinker. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's the reality. It's messy and there will always be other things to fix. But you know, I'm on my drive here, I was reading, I'll get arrested for saying this now. I was listening to this book, Critical Race Theory and a Primer, right? And they were talking about change and talking about when change needs to be incremental and when it needs to be more radical. And the reality is that living through this decolonial lens, you are going to move towards more radical change and you're not going to be satisfied or happy with incremental change because you'll start to see all of these things that need to be adjusted and you'll do something to make them happen. So that was a long, messy answer, but I don't know if it kind of responded. What do we tell students? Be brave, right? And actually, at OCAD, it's such a different space to other spaces that I've been because students are brave, you know, because they hear this stuff all the time. So they'll tell you, they'll put up their hand and they'll tell you when something's not working. Or, you know, I'm the dean, I get 100 emails complaining about XYZ. But, you know, on the other hand, I have to look and say, oh, well, actually this person feels empowered enough to actually come and complain. So, you know, it's messy. That was a long answer.
Okay, how do you get your students to start having difficult conversations? Do they feel limited when they don't have similar experiences?
So the positionality wheel, or any variation of it, because the wheel is really, the wheel is tied to writing a positionality statement. And I'm going to get to your question. I'm just kind of going around in circles, right? I saw, when I was a grad student, I saw people writing positionality statements, and I thought, oh, we don't write those in design. We don't even acknowledge our different positionalities in a design studio, or, you know, in a class or in the workspace. And that's how this tool came up, that I was trying to figure out how to get people to kind of embark on the kind of reflective thinking that they would do for a positionality statement. But we're designers. We don't want to write a 3-page essay. That's an oversimplification. But you know, really it was that. How do I get people, how do I create a space, even if it's 15 minutes, where we could reflect on identity, right? And when I was teaching, because I don't teach now, I would start every semester. The first class, we talk about, we analyze our group positionality. And then not every single class, but in a few of the classes, we would actually talk more intentionally about intersectionality. And those conversations laid the groundwork where people could kind of talk more about different experiences. I used to teach in North Carolina, and so, you know, North Carolina is an interesting space, you know, because you're talking about urban and rural, or you could talk very specifically about race in North Carolina because, you know, it has a fairly large black population, white population. There are all of these different groups in North Carolina. And like I said, there's the urban-rural tension. There are other things that you could talk about. And so starting my courses in this way meant that we could talk about many different identities at the start of the term, and we could continue some of those conversations throughout the term, right? And I would find that students would get a little bit bolder throughout the term and talk about more things, right? Like maybe they didn't want to talk about gender at the start of the term, but as we went on, we would talk about it more. This is a course that I taught which was set up kind of like a social studies course for design students. And then as we went through the term, they would talk more and more and more about which issues affected them. And then by the end of the class, they had to choose an issue that they wanted to make some change in, right? So to really answer your question, we have to create specific spaces where people can talk about identity and maybe not be, either just be willing to learn, to listen, or be able to say things without having, not unkind things, of course, but, you know, saying things without having to worry necessarily about the consequences. You know, you need some spaces where people can feel safe to just come and say things outright. So that's what I used. I did get some feedback occasionally. Not generally, the feedback was good. Every now and again, there'd be one person who'd be like, "Oh my God, this lady and her oppressions," or "This lady and her critical race theory." But really, I didn't focus only on one oppression. I spoke about many different oppressions, you know, and the message throughout the class was that actually we have to learn to understand where we're seeing injustice, regardless of the injustice. And then when people started to actually be able to identify, oh, X injustice actually happens to me, my family, whatnot, then they could start to relate to the other injustices. So yeah, finding common threads as well across people.
I think it's probably not a quick question, but sort of building off of that, leaving space for things to be uncomfortable and that finding a safe space for things to be uncomfortable. I noticed in your designer's critical alphabet, one of the things I found, you define each one, but then the second part of each card is a series of questions. Can you talk a little bit about getting to those questions? Because to me, I'm noticing like a nice series of questions that happen throughout all the slides. And those questions, to me, sort of pull out that uncomfortable bit. So can you talk about how you got from defining each thing to the questions you chose to pull out about each of those? So
I guess it is, so the question is an application question where, you know, people have actually asked me, well, why is it called a designer's critical alphabet? Because there are a lot of people who are not designers who have bought it, right? And the question was about making theory applicable to designers because, you know, I might think, well, okay, critical race theory doesn't apply to me as a designer, and why do I need to know about it, right? Or any of those, intersectionality. And so the way the deck was made is that, yes, there's a term that might be a little bit buzzy. It's a buzzword that's out there. There is a definition, but it had to be a 2-line definition. This is our problem as designers. You know, we're dealing with this real estate, which is like 3.5 inches by 3.5 inches. So it had to be a really reduced definition. And then the question is about making it make sense for a designer. So like the critical race theory question, I think is about, which actually it's an oversimplification. I'm now writing an article, believe it or not, about critical race theory and design. And I pick up this card, I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe I did this in 2018. But the question is really about how is the design, how does the experience of design change if the person is of another race or something like that? You all are reading this and I can't read it. But, you know, I was trying to, like, that literally probably happened when we were in those conversations where we'd always talk about Airbnb. And I was thinking, well, okay, if the host is race X, one host is race X and the other host is race Y, does that change? Now, the thing with the questions is that I'm not actually, none of the questions are yes, no questions. The questions are all discussion questions, right? And the answer, of course, is it depends. Or, you know, the answer is not, you're not meant to get a conclusive answer. We're just creating space for people to talk about these things and then recognize, or even for the individual user to just reflect.
Well, that was the one that stood out to me is what if there isn't representation on that design team? How do you have that conversation, right? So I found those, as I was reading through the questions, those felt to be the most challenging aspect of it, but engaging nonetheless.
I can tell you that there is, so actually I have another set of questions. I mean, I went through like about 5 years of work where literally people were just asking me to come up with questions. So I worked at the Taylor Center at Tulane for 2 years. And we created, we did create a list of questions that are really hard and includes questions like that, right? Who is here and who is not? And, you know, what do you do if these people are missing? And so those questions, a version of them is in this book. I don't recall where. I think it's on a blue page. It's just funny to see. But yeah, I've been thinking about the questions and compiling questions. And I think there is a list of 20 questions on page 118. And I think that there might be another list of questions, which are some of these questions that I've just collected over time. And yes, the questions are difficult, right? And the classroom ends up being a good space to test that difficulty. Because like, I will say again, if I put on my administrator hat, the difficult conversation classes that I taught for about 5 years before taking on this role have prepared me for some of these scenarios, right? I'm still unprepared. Like, I am conflict averse. And, you know, I just want to be nice and I want to be friends with everyone. And now I'm in these situations where I have to make a decision. I have to have these difficult conversations. But at least, you know, like people might wonder, why do we do some of these thought exercises in class? You're sometimes modeling conversations that you have to have later on, right? Or you are testing your value system in this academic context before you go out into the real world where the focus might be different. And, you know, if you haven't had enough tests then of your value system earlier on, you might be just completely swayed when you reach into the workplace. And the reality is we need people who will slow things down, who will ask hard questions, who will, because that person's role actually ends up being also protecting the organization, right? Because remember, the organizations like these phrases like, what is it? Think fast, move fast, and break things. We need somebody to be slowing things down, and that's the person who probably was active in this conversation about ethics and society and relationships and whatnot. You haven't even asked one question.
I haven't, but I get to monopolize your time later today. We're having a small dinner tonight if anybody is interested. And we're going to talk about technology, AI, Western hegemony in systems, embedded cultural habits, and a few other things. But I actually think your last comment is probably a fantastic spot to wrap this up, because for you as students, what Lesley-Ann is talking about is that you use the school as a system of exploration to define the boundaries of who you are. And if you don't start to extend that and start to reflect on things that you take for granted, you don't develop. And when you move into practice, you don't have the tools you need. And so what I appreciate what you're doing is actually working between theory and practice, but doing that by producing tools and methodology, which there's not enough people doing it. And working in a space which is complicated while not being reductive. And still having to come up with an answer.
Oh gosh.
Which
yeah.
is really, really hard. And it's learning how to hold on as things, you have to make things simple again in order to do an outcome. But doing that without losing the essence of what matters is the key of what you're trying to learn. So at that point, I'd just like to thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Dr. Lesley-Ann Noel.
Thank you.